when you look at the criminal justice system, the enforcers of a system that has disproportionately impacted communities of color since the time that we were brought into this country, the police department have been the enforcers of this system. And so, you know, that's why when we look at the riots and it's a manifestation of the violence that has been inflicted upon Black people time and time again, whether it was in slavery, civil rights, Jim Crow, war on drugs, you know, time and time, mass incarceration.
Joining me right now is the state's attorney for Baltimore, Marilyn Mosby. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Jamal. I really appreciate it.
You did a piece in the Washington Post on Sunday because you were the prosecutor during the Freddie Gray trial, and you chose to level charges against those police officers, and a whole bunch of things happened after that. One of the things that happened in Minnesota that I just want to get your reaction to is the original county prosecutor sort of implied that you rushed to judgment against the police officers in Baltimore. Did you rush to judgment in that Baltimore case?
So let me first start by saying, you know, like any sort of normal person in this situation, I'm utterly disgusted by the video of an officer with the authority and the autonomy of the state to sit up there and to watch as a life is being sucked out of an individual for more than 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And then for him to ignore the cries for help. So I was very much surprised when my colleague pretty much deflected from his inaction and interjected me and stated that I had a rush to judgment. I was one of the first prosecutors in the country to actually apply police accountability in the Freddie Gray case. And when I look at the uprising and I look at the situation, it is bringing back somewhat of a deja vu. It took us actually 18 days to assess and evaluate the evidence before we ultimately concluded that we were going to charge 6 officers that were responsible. We believe to be, and we still believe, we had sufficient probable cause to arrest the individuals that were responsible for Freddie Gray's death. This was an innocent 25-year-old Black man who made eye contact with police, who was unconstitutionally arrested, who was placed in a metal wagon, head first, feet shackled, handcuffed. His spine was partially severed in the back of that wagon, and his pleas for medical attention were ignored. We followed the facts with the law, and I wouldn't do anything differently.
What ended up happening in the results of the Freddie Gray investigation in your prosecution?
So what I can tell you is that we tried, we attempted to try all 6 of the officers. The first officer was tried in front of a jury, and there was a hung jury, and we intended to try him again. And the other 3 officers that we tried subsequent to that officer, we could not pick the order of the officers that we tried. It was tried in front of the same judge, and the same judge acquitted all 3 officers, understanding that the judge was well within his right to determine the facts and determine what happened in the case. I dismissed the remaining charges in light of the fact that it was most likely than not those officers were going to continue to have a bench trial. And so, you know, 5 of them were brought up on administrative charges. 2 of them pled guilty in the administrative hearing. 2 were actually acquitted. And then the police commissioner made a determination to dismiss the other charge. And so, you know, when it comes to police accountability reform, I think we can talk about that. We know and understand and recognize that that's needed. We can talk about police, you know, training for officers, but I think it's a lot deeper than that, right? At the end of the day, what this is all about is that when you have the courage and as a prosecutor, you have the discretion to charge you make the determination who's going to be charged, what they're going to be charged with, what sentence recommendations they're going to make. That is an awesome amount of power, right? You have the power, the ability to apply one standard of justice. And the lessons that I learned in trying those cases was that comes with a whole great deal of backlash. comes with intimidation. It comes with harassment. You know, I was sued. I was, my professional, personal credibility was put at issue. The credibility of the victim in this case was put at issue. He was made out to be a drug dealer that deserved, for some reason or another, to die the way that he did. So that,
I mean, they dox you. They put out your address. Pictures of your kids. I mean, they went after you with full force, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, and I had to learn very early on not to internalize that type of backlash. It was bigger than me. It was greater than me. You know, when I received an obituary describing how my husband would be killed outside of my home and no officers would respond, right? Or when we got hate mail that was sent to the office on numerous occasions, calling me every type of name that you could imagine. It was always, I tried to keep it into perspective and understand that we were pushing against the status quo. These are, you know, when you look at the criminal justice system, the enforcers of a system that has disproportionately impacted, you know, when you look at the criminal justice system, the enforcers of a system that has disproportionately impacted communities of color since the time that we were brought into this country. The police department have been the enforcers of this system. And so, you know, that's why when we look at the riots and it's a manifestation of the violence that has been inflicted upon Black people time and time again, whether it was in slavery, civil rights, Jim Crow, war on drugs, you know, time and time, mass incarceration, the communities of color since the time that we were brought into this country. The police department have been the enforcers of this system. And so, you know, that's why when we look at the riots and it's a manifestation of the violence that has been inflicted upon Black people time and time again, whether it was in slavery, civil rights, Jim Crow, war on drugs, you know, time and time, mass incarceration.
It's 2020, but this could be 1920, it could be 1820, it could be 1720, right? Like we still have this same construct that we're all living under. You know, I talked to Congressman Eric Swalwell last week, and he was in the prosecutor's office when Oscar Grant was killed out in Oakland, California, which ended up being the movie Fruitvale Station, which people might remember. But he said his belief is, and I think you might have some insight on this, that you should remove these cases from the jurisdiction where the prosecutor and the police work together hand in hand every day, because it just doesn't usually work out.
So absolutely. I think that, you know, one of the biggest hurdles that we saw and the deck was stacked against us was that the police department was working against us. There were individuals that were witnesses in the case that were assigned to investigate the case. You know, there were search and seizure warrants that we asked to be executed that they allowed to expire and without actually effectuating it. There were times in which throughout the case, there was discovery that was provided to the defendants that was never provided to us, like notes that contradicted the medical examiner's report. And then we were held somehow in violation of discovery, even though the defendants already had it and they had never intentionally turned it over to us. So, you know, I don't think it's just exclusive to police departments, but no sort of occupation should be in charge of investigating its own. So an independent investigation and investigatory practices are especially needed when it comes to police accountability.
Okay, so you know that former Congressman Keith Ellison, who's now the Attorney General in the state of Minnesota, is taking over the case from the county prosecutor.
Yep.
What would be the 3 lessons or pieces of advice that you would give him, the most important things you learned from the Freddie Gray process that you would want him to remember?
So I think this is a good thing in this instance, but I think that we have to be careful because it could set a really bad precedence. The one thing that you have to understand and recognize is that prosecutors can be held accountable. Local prosecutors should be held accountable. And so if you decide not to do your job, people within the community can get you out of there. And we've seen that in Ferguson. We've seen that in Chicago. We've seen that all across the country. And when, in this instance, you know, the attorney general, which was appointed by the governor to take over the case, it could in this instance, it's a good case, good situation, but it could easily be a bad situation, right? Like if the governor has the authority and you set a precedence to be able to come in and take someone's case and assign it to someone else, that's a very sort of dangerous precedence that we're setting. And so the one thing the advice that I would give to Mr. Ellison is be prepared for the intimidation, but do not be deterred by it. I think we have the power and the autonomy to really provide and start to rebuild that trust. People are looking for us as prosecutors to apply that one standard of justice. And unless and until we do that, then that uprising is going to continue. People are going to feel unsettled. They're going to feel like the system is against them. And so we have the ability to do that. What I can tell you is that accountability for me in the city of Baltimore, which wasn't being had all across this country, that accountability led to reform. A week after I charged those officers, the Department of Justice came in, exposed the discriminatory policing practices of the 8th largest police department in the country. That exposure also led to reform. We now have a federally enforceable consent decree that even despite the Trump administration that tried to forestall it is still on record, right? And because of that reform, we have a spotlight on the entrenched police corruption of one of the largest police departments in the entire country. And so, you know, justice is always worth the price paid for its pursuit. And although those individual officers weren't held individually and criminally responsible, every single police officer is being held accountable for the actions of a few.
So let me ask you this before we go. What's your relationship like with the police department now after going through this experience? How's it been working?
So, I mean, one of the things that you have to understand and to recognize, and that's just something that, you know, another piece of advice from Mr. Ellison is that once the dust settles and it clears, the picture is no longer pretty. You know, the Band-Aid has been ripped off, and it's going to be up to him and to the police department to try to repair it. I've worked with 5 police commissioners in 3 years, 3 mayors, one of which was convicted and sentenced just recently federally. But that is incredibly, incredibly important. So you have to implement policies that are going to garner that trust. You know, even the idea, and this is the power of the prosecutor that I want us to keep in mind, because it goes deeper than training. It goes deeper than just accountability measures that you're in agreement with on IA records, right? And having a level of transparency that when you decline to prosecute cases, you're publishing that and people know your justification and your rationale. Prosecutors have the power to diminish the engagement for low-level offenses. When you honestly think about why Mr. Floyd was being arrested, right? He was being arrested because he tried to allegedly pass a counterfeit bill, $20 bill, buying groceries in the middle of a global pandemic. You've arrested this man. Freddie Gray was arrested because he made eye contact in a high crime neighborhood and ultimately pinned down, at which point they found a knife. And then he was arrested for a knife. Sandra Bland was arrested for a minor traffic offense. Eric Garner was arrested for selling loose cigarettes.
Right.
These are offenses that should not be charged. And the power of the prosecutor had to be able to go in and say, I don't want this to happen. One of the things that we did throughout this ordeal of the COVID COVID pandemic, as I established and said, we're not going to prosecute, so don't even bother to arrest prostitution, drug possession, rogue and vagabond, urinating in public. We're not doing that. I've already gone on last year and said, you guys don't even bother to arrest individuals for possession of marijuana. It's these types of low-level offenses that can lead to the death of individuals, and that's the biggest problem, and one in which we have to ensure that we are electing progressive prosecutors that aren't afraid to hold police accountable and understand that that examination is important.
And for the